Good evening, and welcome to the City Council special meeting this Monday evening, May 20th. I now call this meeting to order. City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
With pleasure, Madam Mayor. Councilmember Hedges.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Lorraine.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Newsom.
Here.
Mayor Diaz-Nash.
Here. We are excited to be here in person with options for those who choose not to be in person to participate virtually. There are several ways to participate. For those attending in person, please complete a yellow request to speak slip and hand it to the clerk. If participating remotely, please use the raise your hand feature on Zoom and you will be called on at the appropriate time. If calling in via phone, please press *9 to raise your hand, and when called upon, please press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close the public comment period for each specific item. We will begin tonight's special meeting with a closed session. Item number 1, conference with labor negotiators. Now, before we convene to close session, City Clerk, do we have any requests to speak on item number 1?
Madam Mayor, we have no request to speak on this item.
All right, then let's convene to close session in Conference Room B. All right, thank you. We are back from closed session and we're moving on to a study session, potential ballot measures for November 2024, results from community survey and council direction. And we will be joined by our Assistant City Manager, Christina Horsberger, Barry Barnes from Team Civics, and Timothy McClarney, True North Research. So, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Diaz-Nash and members of the council. Before you tonight, we have our ballot measure study session. I am Christina Horsberger, Assistant City Manager. I have with me tonight Dr. Tim McClarney of True North Research and Barry Barnes from Team Civics to my left. I will go ahead and provide an overview of tonight's presentation, and then I will hand it off to Dr. McClarney to discuss our statistically significant survey and the results of that, and our elections consultant, Barry Barnes. There we go. So for the purpose of tonight's study session, we have a few objectives. First, we are going to be seeking direction from council on whether to proceed with education and outreach on the potential ballot measures before you tonight. We are going to have you receive a report from our survey consultant to identify the features of the ballot measures that resonate with voters. And we are going to be gathering information needed for communications and outreach should you direct us to move forward with the potential ballot measures. And so the 4 questions that we are going to be seeking direction on tonight are, number 1, should the city proceed with education and outreach on the land use measure and return to council for a decision whether to place it on the November 2024 ballot? And we'll be providing more specific information on what the land use measure is in a little bit. Number 2, should the city proceed with education and outreach on the charter amendment measures, of which there are 2, and return to council for a decision whether to place them on the November 2024 ballot? Number 3, does the city council have feedback on staff's proposed education and information outreach plan between May 21st and July 14th? And 4, should the land use ballot language be revised to insert the phrase without raising taxes to clarify that there is no tax increase related to the November 2024 ballot? Proposed ballot language is listed on the following slide, which I'll advance to in a sec. But I just want to let you know you're going to get detailed information on all of these things in the slides that'll be presented to you now, and we will end up on these questions again later. And so the proposed measure with the added language in bold that we're asking for direction on would read as follows: to allow for additional affordable housing for low and middle income residents and meet state housing requirements without raising taxes while enhancing parks and open space, protecting existing residential neighborhoods, and reducing traffic impacts. Shall the city of San Mateo's measure be adopted, allowing future housing to be concentrated downtown along the El Camino corridor and near Caltrain stations where it is close to transit, jobs, infrastructure, and services? So for a little bit of background on how we got here, in March of 2024, General Plan 2040 was adopted. There are 5 land use designations contained within General Plan 2040 that exceed the limits of Measure Y height and density limits, and they are within the 10 study areas that are contained in General Plan 2040. In addition, a revised housing element is up for adoption. It'll be presented before you tonight, and there's a program contained in that revised housing element which commits to placing amendments to Measure Y on the November ballot. As for the charter amendments, on December 5th of 2022, at the council meeting that evening, the timing and the mayoral rotation and selection process came into question. The city charter directs the council to select a mayor and deputy mayor at their first meeting in December. While it was legally permissible to continue the selection process to a future date and time, the timing contemplated by the charter was not followed, and those two things didn't happen at the meeting on that night. And so this brings us to the meat of why we're here tonight, and we will go ahead and start talking about the survey results. And so I will hand this off to Dr. Tim McClarney, who is from True North and conducted our statistically significant survey. So I'll let Tim take it away.
Great, thank you. And good evening, Mayor and members of council. Tim McClarney, president of True North Research, a firm that for the last 20 plus years has specialized in working with cities and other types of public agencies in conducting statistically reliable surveys. Today, my business partner and I have designed and conducted over 1,300 research studies, and more than half of these are what we call ballot measure feasibility studies, like what we're going to be talking about here tonight, where the goal is to understand if it's feasible to move forward with some type of ballot measure, meaning does it have a reasonable chance of success, and if it is feasible, to use the research to help guide how you might structure that measure in a way that it's consistent with the type of measure that your community is interested in supporting. Next slide, please. So tonight's presentation covers kind of the main findings of the survey we recently conducted for the city. Before we get into the findings, it's helpful to take a moment to review the methodology of the study or how we went about conducting this research. Anytime you're doing ballot measure feasibility studies like this, the first question you want to address in your methodology is, and think about, is what election is this going to be on? Different elections have different turnouts, and as you expand or shrink turnout, you tend to get a different profile of voters and a different profile to your electorate. And so in this case, we were thinking about that upcoming presidential general election later this year. That is going to be the highest turnout you would normally get in a 4-year cycle. And so we identified every individual in your community that is what we call a likely November voter, based on when they registered to vote in the city, what elections they participated in since that point, as well as some other demographics. We determined that they were an individual who was likely to cast a ballot in the November election. Once we'd identified that group, we use a process called stratified and clustered random sampling, which ensures that at the end of our data collection process, we have a sample that matches your November electorate on all the dimensions that we know tend to drive how people vote on ballot measures. So the proportion of age, gender, partisanship, household party type, where your voters are distributed within the city among your November electorate, our sample matches that. And that's really the key to making sure that this type of research is reliable. Once we had pulled our sample, we used 3 different recruiting methods: email, text, and telephone. Everything is PIN protected so that only those individuals who we randomly sampled and invited to take the survey could take it. They could complete 1 survey per person. They had the choice of doing it either online or by telephone, whichever was their preference, as well as in English or Spanish. We wound up completing 600 interviews as part of this study. And when you have a random sample of 600 interviews, that allows you to better than meet the academic standard for statistical reliability, which is a plus or minus 5% margin of error at the 95% confidence level. In this case, we are plus or minus 4% at the 95% confidence level, meaning we can be 95% confident that the results I'll share with you tonight are within plus or minus 4% of what we would have found had we spoken with all of your likely November voters. Next slide, please. Okay, so on to the results. We had a few warm-up questions at the beginning of the survey, getting folks thinking about their community and local issues. The first of which is we simply asked them how they'd rate the overall quality of life in San Mateo. Would they say it's excellent, good, fair, poor, or very poor? As you can see here on the slide, your residents have a high opinion of the quality of life in the community. You had 83% use either excellent or good to describe the quality of life in the community. About 14% said fair. Less than 3% describe the quality of life in San Mateo as poor or very poor. Next slide, please. So after that rating question, we asked individuals in an open-ended manner, if the city government could change one thing to make San Mateo a better place to live, what change would you like to see? By open-ended, what I mean is we asked them that question, and then we allowed them to tell us in their own words what change came to mind. So we didn't provide them with the list that you see here. They got to just tell us in their own words or write it in a text box. We went back and reviewed those verbatim responses and then grouped them into the categories you see here. So at the very top of the list, the number one thing top of mind for your voters was providing more affordable housing. 14% cited that as the one change they think would improve the quality of life in the community now in the future. That was followed by improving and maintaining infrastructure and roads at 11%, limiting growth, preserving open space, 11%, and on down. So this gives you a sense of what's top of mind for voters. It's also kind of instructive that the number one item on this list has a clear nexus to the ballot measure that you're considering for November. Next slide, please. And then following that, we asked individuals to tell us, generally speaking, are they satisfied or dissatisfied with the job the city of San Mateo is doing to provide city services? Because this survey asked them to, or this question asked them to comment on the city's performance overall, right? We weren't zeroing in on a particular area like streets and roads or police or parks. This can be considered an overall performance rating for the city. Overall, you see you've got 77% of your likely November voters say that they are satisfied with the city's overall performance. You had about 17% who were dissatisfied and the rest unsure. I get to ask this type of question in a lot of communities around the state, and I can tell you that 77%, particularly for a community of your size, is a nice, solid, very high answer. The range that we're seeing these days, top range is sort of high 80s, and I've got a number of cities that are in the 40s. So it gives you a sense of the range of responses you can see. Next slide, please. So after those warm-up questions, we get right down to business of what we call the initial ballot test. And the idea here is, before we get any deeper into this interview and we start talking in more detail about the features of this proposal, arguments pro and con related to this measure, we want to present to respondents a mock-up of what we think that ballot statement could look like and get their reaction. The initial ballot test is a really good gauge of where your voters are at on the natural with respect to this proposal, because they don't have any other details beyond what you're seeing here on the slide. And so you can see here the ballot statement up top that we tested, which was consistent with what was shared with you earlier, with the exception of the without increasing tax rates in the parentheses. And then below that, you see the short list of supporters or opponents, which is consistent with the new law in the state for AB 1416 for counties that choose to stay in, and San Mateo County is choosing to stay in. There's that short list of supporters and opponents that can't appear below the 75 words. So that is the initial ballot test language. And on the next slide are the results. So at the initial ballot test, we had 64% of likely November voters say that they would support this proposal. You had 27% opposed, and you had about 9% who were unsure. For this measure to be successful, you need a simple majority, or 50% plus one. And so we are sitting about 14 points north of that simple majority at the initial ballot test. Next slide, please. So if you as a council were to choose to place a measure on the November ballot, there's going to be an election cycle. During that election cycle, there's going to be a lot of discussion and debate in the community about this proposal. You'll have some folks who will advocate on behalf of this measure, right? They'll go out and talk to their friends and neighbors, explain why this is needed and why they should vote yes. You might also get some opponents step up, say, this is a terrible idea, we shouldn't be doing it, and here's why. For this survey to be a reliable gauge of the feasibility of this measure, we need to simulate that discussion and debate in the space of the interview, so we have a really good understanding not only where your voters are at on the natural, which was that initial ballot test, but what happens to their opinions about the proposal once they're confronted with both arguments in favor of this measure as well as arguments opposed. So we do that in the space of the poll by testing both positive and negative arguments. Here you see the positive arguments that we tested. The nature of the question is, supporters of the measure say blank, you insert a positive argument. And do you think this is a very convincing, somewhat convincing, or not at all convincing reason to support the proposal? You can see here that a lot of the arguments on behalf of this proposal get traction. The number one being that San Mateo has become so expensive that longtime residents, seniors, and younger residents are being pushed out of the city because they can't afford to stay. We need more affordable housing to give residents a chance to keep living in their neighbors. So it's really an argument that centers around existing residents being able to stay in the community in which they've grown accustomed to living. So at this point in the interview, voters have heard a little more than they did at the initial ballot test, right? We had a chance to convey the positive arguments. So we circle back to what we call our interim ballot test on the next slide, where we present that same 75-word ballot statement. We say, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand? And as you can see here, that after the supportive arguments, as you might imagine, support ticks up a little bit. We started at 64%. We're now at 66%. So we're a full 16 points north of that simple majority required for passage. And then on the next slide, we get to the negatives. And the idea behind the negatives is I want to pressure test a respondent's willingness to support this proposal by peppering them with a series of opposition arguments, right? We want to present a series of arguments that are designed to give them reasons to vote no on this measure. So we have an understanding of how resilient that yes vote is. Should you get opposition? Should they be effective at getting their message out? As you can see here, we tested a series of negative arguments. The number one just had to do with the idea that, you know, voters approved Measure Y in 2020. That was just 4 years ago, right? And you were already back asking them, the city's asking them to undo Measure Y, and you know, we've already spoken on this issue. You guys just need to listen. That was the number one negative, but you can see some of these negatives do get some traction. The real question is what happens afterwards, and that's on the next slide. So the negatives cool us down about 4 points from where we were at the interim ballot test to 62%, right? So we're about 4 points down from the interim ballot test. We're 2 points lower than we were when we started, but we're still landing at 62%, which is a full 12 points north of that simple majority that's required for passage. It's interesting. One of the things about what's interesting in people's perception of this measure as you go through the interview is sometimes when we work on ballot measures, you get a lot of volatility, right? That you get a lot of movement between ballot tests based on positive arguments, based on negative arguments, and other information. Here you see in the aggregate, the total swing here is just 4 points, right? The highest we were is at 66, the lowest we were at 62. You also, interestingly enough, when you dig behind the overall results and you look at it at the individual voter level, you also see a fair amount of stability there. Less than 1 in 5 voters that we surveyed switched positions on this measure over the course of the interview. We normally see a little more shifting happening as people learn more facts about a measure. They'll often switch from one position to another, and that's a yes to a no, or an undecided to a yes, or an undecided to a no. So there's a lot of ways you can move, and just 17%, so less than 1 in 5, actually make a fundamental move. And for the most part, it's offsetting, which is why we end the survey just 2 points different from where we were at the beginning. Next slide, please. So in addition to looking at the building heights and densities measure, we also took a moment in the survey to ask about a charter amendment that deals with how, like, the sort of the when and the how of selecting the mayor and deputy mayor in the city. There were 2 parts to this. Part 1, as you can see here, dealt with the when, right? It required that the selection of the mayor and the deputy mayor must occur at the first regular council meeting following the election, can't be postponed without unanimous consent of council or a natural disaster. Part 2 deals with the how of selecting the mayor and the deputy mayor, and that in the future it would be follow a set rotation based on seniority rather than being selected by a vote of current council members. And once somebody is served a term as mayor, they go to the back of the line, so to speak, and so the other council members move up. So we were asking whether they would support or oppose those 2 parts of the amendment in separate questions, and the results are on the next slide. So you can see part 1 on the left, which deals with the when of selecting the mayor and deputy mayor. That was strongly supported. You had 63% of respondents say they would support that part of the amendment, 9% opposed, the rest unsure. Part 2, which dealt with the how question, right? And the proposal to make it based on seniority. That, as you can see, was much more divided in terms and mixed in terms of responses. You had 34% who supported that, 38% who opposed, and the remainder being unsure. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is my final slide. So what does all this mean? You know, I mentioned at the outset that, you know, one of the goals of this type of research is to understand if it's feasible, meaning if you as a council were to choose to put this measure on the November ballot, does it have a reasonable chance of success? I think the answer to that is clearly yes, for all the reasons you see there under the positive signs. We saw that the number 1 issue in the community was providing additional affordable housing, right? That was the thing that was top of mind for most voters. And that sentiment, along with the nature of the ballot proposal that was presented to voters, translated into strong natural support for this proposal. You had 64% of respondents who, just based on the ballot statement, indicated that they would support this proposal. And with positive arguments, that increased a bit to 66%. And importantly, at each point in the survey where we came back to them, we presented that same 75-word ballot statement and said, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand? All of those ballot tests were well north of the simple majority required for passage, and that was even after opposition arguments. So that's the kind of pattern that we want to see in place for a measure to have a reasonable shot at success on election day. That said, there's also some challenges that come out of the poll, or that when you think about what this next election cycle is going to look like, are things to keep in mind. We did see that there was some receptivity to the potential opposition arguments. When compared to where we were at the interim ballot test, it dropped support for the proposal about 4 points. There was a small percentage of folks who were no on this measure because they seemed to be confused that it was a tax measure, right? Even though it doesn't have the word tax in there, I think they were reading between the lines and thinking that, well, if we're going to provide more affordable housing and do some of these other things that are mentioned in the ballot statement, that there must be an embedded tax here. And so that's why, in part, that recommendation to include the without increasing taxes is part of our discussion tonight. In terms of another challenge, is the electoral climate, right? We're going to be headed into what is, not what I would call a feel-good election, right? Sometimes you get those types of elections where everyone's feeling good about how things are going and there's not a lot of controversy out there. We're headed into an election cycle that's going to have a bitter, hyper-partisan presidential contest, and that's going to set the tone in some ways for the environment. And so, we just want to keep that in mind as you're thinking about, moving forward with this proposal. And then finally, that sort of plays into the timing of the charter amendments. The question of whether you would want to put those charter amendments right next to this other measure, or if you'd want to stagger them on separate elections. And so with that, I end my slides and I will hand it back to the city.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, Mayor and Council. I'm Barry Barnes, consultant with Team Civics. We're a consulting firm that's worked with almost every city, school district within San Mateo County in considering ballot measures such as this, as well as public finance measures. And I'm happy to be here today. Our role in working with the city on this project has been to help assess the feasibility of the measures, as well as assisting with communications and outreach strategies to the community prior to when the council could place the measure on the ballot. I want to, before I start my slides, I do want to underline the one number Tim pointed out as we went through the slides. 77% of your residents are satisfied with city services. 80% ranked a very positive quality of life. And while Tim did give some perspective related to other cities, I will say the number of cities that are higher than that, I could count probably on one hand between the number of polls that I've seen, and we have many, many clients. And the vast majority, especially of larger cities, such as San Mateo, most are much closer to 40 or 50% satisfied. The 78, 80% those numbers tend to be reserved for very small communities, not for cities the size of San Mateo. So you all have a lot to be proud of. Next slide, please. So our role in assisting with community outreach is to help the city provide factual, non-biased information regarding the proposed ballot measure to residents. This is similar to work the city has done in the past related to measures, or what you've seen from school districts or others, communicating with residents about the potential measures, both online as well as in the mailbox. We're working with city staff to organize a plan for meeting with stakeholder groups across the community to describe the measures, as well as to receive feedback and answer questions, and then reporting back to the staff and council with these outreach findings. You have a period of time now until the middle of July when you could potentially put the measure on the ballot to go out. And you've heard now from the mass electorate in terms of how they feel. But as we all know, stakeholder groups and individuals are also very important in this process. Next slide, please. And so this is just briefly for the next 3 months, walking through our timeline. We're already underway on drafting a fact sheet, FAQ, website updates. There actually already was an update to the website talking about the polling process, but continuing to go through that. We're working on a slide deck for these presentations to literally, there's a database that we've been working on, literally dozens of organizations to receive presentations, either individual organizations or clusters of organizations with similar missions. And then the first citywide informational mailing, which is scheduled to go out at the end of this month. Again, building from the information following about what the measure could do. I also want to underline all the information is just that, information. There's no advocacy. Everything is balanced, is vetted by the city attorney to ensure that it is vetted and balanced. So this is completely separate and has nothing to do with any sort of advocacy on one way or another that might take place following placement of the measure on the ballot. Next slide, please. In June, we have a digital communication plan to be able to reach those residents who do not look at direct mail. Anybody who has a mailbox and is a registered voter is going to receive the direct mail. But we know folks, not just young voters, but others, the mail stacks up and they don't look at it. And this is important information about the measure. So we will have digital communications as part of the plan that links to the city website. The outreach meetings continue. Really, June will be the heaviest month for those meetings. And then a second informational mailing, again, which will recap some of what we're hearing, as well as preparing residents for the upcoming meeting in July that you would all have to potentially put this on the ballot. Next slide. And then in July, again, as we said, would be the final mailing. The digital communications would conclude, the outreach meetings. All of this would conclude in advance of July 15th, which is a council date when you would consider placement of measures on the ballot in November. And so there have been, prior conversations, and as Tim highlighted in his slides, one of the important issues we looked at were not just the ballot measure related to zoning, but also the potential charter amendments. And certainly, we were asked to put together a list of pros and cons of placing the measure on the ballot, of placing the charter amendments on the ballot this November. That's kind of, I guess, under the assumption, if you were to also place the zoning measures on the ballot, if that was an assumption, what would be the impact of the charter amendments? But obviously, we can't assume before that you would vote. The polling shows, though, that after brief descriptions, it's a little typo there, more than 25% of the voters are unsure of their positions on the charter amendments. So if you remember back to the slides that Tim did a few ago, you saw that on the zoning measure, the undecideds or the unsure was about 8% across the board. But otherwise, people were locking in on yes and no. Over 25% of the voters were unsure, undecided, unclear on the charter amendments. So, to us, Tim and I've, these are collaborative recommendations. What that says to us is that there's a lot of confusion or lack of information out there, which is not surprising given you've been talking, the city has been talking about land use and zoning and housing for years, many years. And this is something that, while has been a prime issue for the council, is relatively new to voters. So it's not too surprising, but the number of the percentage of those who are unsure is 3x compared to the zoning measure. Also, as Tim pointed out, that we also saw that the second part, the second measure, which is related to the sequencing of mayor and vice mayor, is dividing the community right now. I mean, it was in the basically 35-35 zone or somewhere in there. And one concern we have is that a measure like this can serve as a lightning rod in an election if it's placed next to any other measure, whether it's a zoning measure, whether it's a public finance measure. When you have something that divides the community, many times there could be spillover. Like, okay, well, we may have our minds made up on that other measure, but then because of this other fight, that then can make things more complicated and just make it more challenging. And so we do want to point out that that if they were to appear on the same ballot, we do have a concern that lightning rod, the raw emotion attached to the amendments, could have an impact on the zoning measure, which we just talked about. If other options, if you were to choose to not to place the charter amendments in the future, June of 2026 is when the primary election will be held, as opposed to we will be out of the March primary, at least for a couple of years, and into June primary in 2026. This one advantage of this is that it would allow this additional time for the public information that we just talked about and discussion with the community to hopefully lower that number of people who are unsure closer to lower than the 24% now. And as far as we know, there are not any other competing local or city ballot measures which could be impacted. The con, obviously, it delays closure of the issue, and there would need to be, a need to do that education information in the future. And then finally, November of 2026 is another option. Again, similar to on the last measure, as we mentioned, this would allow the additional time for that information in the community. The cons, if there was a potential public finance measure in 2026, we could have the similar lightning rod effect or distraction that we flagged as a concern with the zoning measure in 2024. And again, another con is obviously it delays closure on the issues.
So thank you, Barry, and thank you, Dr. McClarney. That concludes the substantive part of our presentation and brings us back to our 4 questions for council consideration and to the next portion of our meeting.
Thank you very much.
Please, I'd like to say something. When it's proper, I'd like to make it.
Yep. Okay. Just a second. Whoops, I did wrong.
Madam Mayor, would you like to go to public comment?
Yes, I was looking for my correct agenda. Thank you very much. Could we please open up public comment?
Absolutely. So if you wish to speak on this item, if you haven't already, please provide me with a request to speak slip. If you are attending remotely, please raise your hand now. Madam Mayor, I have one request to speak. So that will be 3 minutes.
Yes.
So I will invite up Michael Reagan. And Michael Reagan will be the last speaker on this item.
We're all ears.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks for giving me opportunity to speak. My name is Michael Reagan, and I've been a resident since 1979, so I'm dating myself here. I just want to let you know that I do oppose this Measure Y ballot. I just want to go on record as saying that I feel that, the residents, citizens of San Mateo passed it. And as with you sitting up there, except for Mr. Hedges, you were all voted in to your positions by a majority, as was this measure, which was fought over quite with a lot of difficulty by the people that supported it. Over $1 million was spent trying to defeat it. The city council was against it. They even had their own measure. The other point is we're now at 2024. By the time this becomes effective, it'll be 2025. And this thing only has 5 years left. Now, I was at the meeting when you were all appointed, or the majority were appointed, and it was your first couple of meetings. And Mayor Lee at the time asked you if you supported Measure Y, and none of you raised your hands, and that basically opened the door to where we are right now. And I feel that you had just been elected, and I think you should have been more responsive to the people that voted for this Measure Y. I think it was quite important. But like I said, here we are now. We talk about low-cost housing. Now, Measure Y does provide for low-cost housing. It's at least 10%, and it could be more. And we only have 4 after this particular year gets by, and if it does get passed, we only have a few more years left. Also last year, the Planning Commission came and told you that they passed their housing element with the approval of Measure Y in the first 7 years of this kind of housing element that goes on for many more years. So I'm not sure why we're here. And my final point is we're spending $250,000 on this measure, and I'm sure there would be more spent. There's always an additional amount. And I hear that we're $10 million in a deficit, and I'm wondering how you guys can justify that. I think it's time to put the brakes on, let this thing run its course, and
Thank you.
in 10 years, in
Thank you, Michael.
2030, we can
Thank you, Michael.
revote.
Your time is up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the mayor, just as I was calling the last speaker, an additional hand was raised. We will take this last comment. Jordan Grimes, please unmute your mic.
Yes, good evening, council. Really appreciate the information from True North. The report for me is, I guess, equal parts validating and infuriating. Validating because once again, we hear from residents that affordable housing is top of mind and see significant support for what the measure purports to do. Concentrate and create new high-density housing downtown along El Camino and near public transit. But this is where the infuriating part comes in. If only the ballot measure actually did that in any significant, effective way. The reality is that the upzoning this general plan ballot measure would create is so weak and narrowly tailored that it will utterly fail to create the housing we need. Despite years of input and work and time spent on the general plan process, housing advocates have been left with a milquetoast measure that barely moves the needle. It didn't have to be this way, but it is. Which leads to an interesting question. Who will actually support this measure? In 2020, on Measure Y, there was a robust, multifaceted coalition. I would not expect anything like that this time around. Housing advocates have been burned repeatedly by both city staff and the council. Many of us are leaning toward rolling the dice and seeing what happens when the city can't satisfy a key part of the housing element requirements. True North says that this measure can be passed, provided that it is accompanied by robust community and opinion leader engagement, education, and communication. Who, I wonder, will do that? Certainly won't be me.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That concludes public comment.
Thank you very much. And so now I will close public comment and bring it back to the council for questions and comments. Who would like to start? Would you like to, Councilmember Lee?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to review this information. I have a couple of specific questions for Dr. McClarney. You mentioned that around 17% of the likely voters polled were susceptible to change their position. And I was wondering, have you done any demographic analysis on their voter profile?
I have not offhand looked at exactly who those individuals are. Like I said, they offset each other. So you get, people moving different ways, which oftentimes when you have that pattern, the makeup of the people who move isn't strikingly different than the overall. If you get a case where you get a lot of movement in one direction, then you tend to see more distinct patterns typically to those individuals, but it is something we can look at.
I think it's worthwhile to look at that because you see a really stark difference between the voter support for community members that, for example, have lived in San Mateo for 15 years and longer. It would be helpful for us to better understand if there's a pattern that we should be looking at in the community education efforts. And another question I have is, based on your, this is for both civics, Team Civics and True North, it's very important for us to work with full information, and polling is very, important effort. And that being said, polling numbers and sort of political or public consciousness can change over time. And, based on your experience with land use measures, what is your sort of best crystal ball analysis in terms of how you see land use polling change, especially given the nature of this ballot measure, looking at increasing heights and densities, which have been largely contentious issues. So, I think just providing some overall context based on your expertise, I think would be very helpful.
You want to go first, Barry? You want me to take that?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So from a
Second.
polling perspective, the thing that strikes me is, your residents have had a chance to think about this multiple times in the past, not necessarily this exact proposal, but the issue of, building heights and densities and how do we accommodate growth, right? So this isn't the first time that this has been addressed. Obviously, the city's general plan update has been long in the making at this point, and so in a lot of discussion and debate in your community. The thing that strikes me in looking at your poll numbers is the stability that we're seeing in the poll numbers reflects in part that history, right? That we've seen this in other measures where, if you've had an issue that's popped up over time, several points, and has maybe gone to ballot in one form or another previously, that over time, what tends to happen is your voters have already kind of thought about this and made their mind up to some degree, right, on an issue. And so there's just more stability there than you would see if this issue sort of popped out of thin air and the community hadn't thought about it before. So, when I look ahead on this, obviously, this is, even though your numbers on this measure are north of that simple majority, you also have cases. You think about the Measure Y election, that was a very close election last time. So this is an issue that divides the community. Sometimes it divides it a little bit more one way than the other. The other thing I would just say is, part of the key in when I think of this measure moving forward is, voters have to understand that, there's consequences to any decision, right? And that what you're wrestling with as a city is how to accommodate growth, or potential growth, and how do you plan for potential growth in the future? It is state mandated that you plan to accommodate this, and as a city, you have a choice of either concentrating it to some degree in the way that you're proposing here, or letting it spread out through the city. And so that's an important part too, to helping kind of understand how you can land here, because it's important when you message that people understand that, right? The alternative isn't, oh, if I vote no on this, everything just stays the same. Right? That's not the reality. It's important that they understand that this is the proposal for how we're proposing to deal with future growth. But if this isn't approved, the alternative may actually be something they find less appealing.
I'll just agree with what Tim said, but also underline the fact that, I mean, we went rather quickly through the survey, but the number of positive arguments and negative arguments that were tested was robust. I mean, we really threw the kitchen sink at both sides of the argument. I mean, every possible positive argument and pretty much, I believe, every possible negative argument was tested. With that context, I would go back to what Tim said when he started, which is what's striking is the stability. I mean, we see a lot of times when something like this comes up the first time, and I've worked on land use projects. I've worked with cities who are considering land use projects. I've seen a lot of land use polls, and frequently when something comes up for the first time, you might see a big positive number, and then you do the negatives and it craters 20 points. And it's just this volatility, the opposite of the stability we're mentioning. So, I think that, again, that's not to predict. I mean, a campaign's a campaign and anything can happen. And, you all know how that works. But again, from a starting point, I think the stability at least, is notable.
Well, it's as a follow-up to that. I mean, I appreciate that, that our community seems to be stable, which is on this issue, which I would not use that word to characterize this community on land use issues. And we've seen, with Measure Y, very favorable polling results end up on the opposite side, come election day. So there's that. Also, given what we can anticipate to be sort of a lackluster campaign for, in terms of like looking at the campaign strategy, there's a gap or a void in a base and coalition of support for the measure. However, on the opposition side, there is a very active opposition against it. Does that in any way shape your, your sort of confidence in, in the positioning that we have sort of a stable number to rely on and that there won't be large swings?
Well, I can't, I think you raise a good point, but at the same time, we can't predict exactly who would be active in a campaign. I will say part of the outreach that we have planned for the next 8 weeks is talking to, there are housing organizations, environmental organizations, business, labor organizations, all the folks who tend to take neighborhood organizations, every single one of them, who will tend to weigh in on this. And so I think, part of that fact, that is information that will be better positioned to relay back to you in July following that outreach to see, if, we had one speaker raise concerns with it, but to see how many allies in that, that space would tend to agree. And so I think we will have a better sense after that outreach of where those organizations might tend to come down.
And remind me, your plan was taking us to July, and then at what point, remind me again, what is the cutoff point for the city's education and outreach efforts?
So typically what we'll do is basically July 15th, if the council decides to go ahead and place the ballot measure, the potential measure on the ballot, we'll go ahead and shut down at that point.
So basically after July 15th, there's not going to be a concerted education effort run by the city, and we will be entirely reliant on a coalition to run the campaign after July 15th. Okay, thank you. So then I have another question about and I'm looking at time and I feel like we're going to need more.
We're going to go over 15 to 7:15 at this point.
But let's everybody try and be concise.
I think this is a very important topic that might need more time personally.
Let's see where we're at 7:15.
Okay, so then, one of the number one reasons that that the opposition to the land use measure was, or sorry, excuse me, one of the top reasons to oppose the land use measure was a concern around traffic. And I noticed that in the proposed language of the ballot measure, reducing traffic impacts is there, but it's sort of buried in the middle. And I'm wondering, is there, has there been consideration in reordering the that specific benefit to better highlight it? Because it seems to me, if that's one of the number one issues to oppose it, is this misunderstanding that increased heightened density and increased housing actually drives traffic. That's a fundamental false misunderstanding that's taken hold in this community. It seems to me that that is something we have a real opportunity to highlight in this language. And I'm wondering, had that idea been considered?
I mean, the final decision on the 75 words will be made by your body in July. In July, I will say that you're right. While it is a significant concern, we also saw that the number one concern is affordable housing. So, it's that balance, and that we want to be sure people understand in the first 6 words, this is not it's not a transportation measure. It's not a redo of your county transportation tax. But it's certainly something that we can look into and consider and discuss. But I think that our recommendation for ordering this way was based on how high affordable housing has tested in the past.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question about the outreach and education efforts, are we planning on doing a concerted multilingual campaign? Is that incorporated as well? And if so, how?
Yes, all materials will be available multilingual.
In which languages?
Spanish, and then I believe might have translation opportunities on our website with Mandarin.
Okay, so we were saying all materials will be printed in 3 languages?
Not all materials in 3 languages. It would be English, similar to what we've done with our newsletters. We do in English, but then there's the translation that you can go ahead and click, and it'll all be on the website electronically.
Okay. Okay, and then, so switching over to the charter amendment questions, I was hoping that we might have some historical information on our previous ballot measures that encompass charter reforms. What years were they proposed? What was the percentage of support and opposition? Were they successful?
Right, well, this was previously compiled by the city clerk's office, and there's a long list of charter measures that date back to, I think it's approximately 1937. It's about 60 measures or so. It's been kind of a mixed bag. About half have passed and about half have failed. And, it depends on the substance of the measure too. One thing that just a pure list of measures doesn't account for across the board is what other measures were on the ballot. Although based on some quick research by a city clerk, there was one election in 1991 where the original Measure H, which was the predecessor to Measure Y, a couple of elections ago, was on the ballot with a couple of charter amendments, and Measure 8 had passed, and the two charter amendments failed. That may have been because of the substance of the charter amendments, but the point is the charter amendments have not had a high rate of success. It's been kind of mixed over the decades.
Is that true if you look at the last, say, 20 years?
I haven't isolated the last 20 years. I just did a quick look at the total number of charter amendments since they began tracking them, or since they've been put on the
There's only a
ballot.
handful in the last 20 years. Is it in front of you?
It's in front of me. I would have to count though.
I can wait.
Well, I don't know if we want to move to some
Yeah,
other.
why don't we continue? Are you
Yes.
finished, Councilmember Lee, or do you have other questions?
Yes. So I guess I want to also ask about cost. So have we done a budget analysis of what the cost would be to put the charter amendments on this ballot versus June primary versus November of 26? Is there a significant cost associated with any of those choices?
So one thing I would just add through the mayor for costs for elections, ballot measure questions, typically those tend to be less expensive during presidential general election cycles than November even year elections. And that is due to the fact that multiple agencies are also putting ballot measures out to voters within the county. So those costs are spread out throughout all of the agencies. The sort of second lesser tier down in terms of cost would be the gubernatorial or presidential primary. That would be due to the fact that there are more contests on the ballot. And then the most expensive options being those off-year elections, those odd-numbered year elections.
So would it be fair to say that if we move forward with the charter amendments this year, that the budgetary impacts would be smaller than if we were to wait in June and November in 26?
So it would be November 2024 and November 2026 would be the most cost-effective options. And then June of those three options, June of 2026 would be more expensive, given that there would be likely fewer agencies also going on the ballot.
So November 24 is the most cost-effective.
Along with November 26.
Are they equal?
Without having done any real data research on this,
That's still 2 years out, and typically what you'll see, and I've been doing this 12 years in different cities throughout the county and the elections office. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact amount and cost. Typically, it might be, I'm just going off of my memory, could be the difference of 20, 30,000, most likely, of a difference. But that's just speaking of experience, not in this size of city, not in this organization, but I'm just saying of just, going through 4 election cycles here in this county.
And while you're thinking about that, in the last 30 years, I checked, there have been 7 charter amendments and 3 have failed and 4 have passed. I know you probably have more questions. I'm guessing, Councilmember Lee, I would suggest, given the time, that perhaps other council members may have something to add.
Thank you very much. All right, who would like to go next? Councilmember Hedges.
Yeah, I was, quite frankly, I thought you did a very good survey, but I thought something was left out. And I want to know if you've considered this. So the second question on the charter amendment that polled poorly, there was something left out from that. In December of 2022, we had an elongated selection of a city council member to replace now Assemblyman Pappen. I was the compromise candidate finally after 3 days. And so I think in this question, what was left out, because I think this is well within institutional memory of that fight which divided the city, was the fact that the mayor will no longer be able to break the tie. And this is very important because this kind of thing over the years, because I've been here 54 years and seen them all come and go. And this creates a lot of disharmony on councils, and it's happened on commissions too. And I think this is a real important reform that really takes politics out of these selections. And by the way, we already do it in rotation of seniority. So that's not a big change, it's just solidifying it. So I would like to see a repolling of this question with more information on what is really happening with this particular measure, part of the measure. Because I think if people understand that it's the mayor's still not going to have the ability to break the tie, it'll change their attitude. So do you have a comment on or?
Um,
Well, I mean, I'll just say that, and Tim could jump in, but I would just say, look, in what we do, more research is always helpful if it's available. So, but that said, I will also say that from my read on it, and Tim and I've talked about it, that I think one reason that part two polled significantly lower than part one was just basic confusion when you look at the question and people try to figure it out. I think to be honest, if there was a way to make that question less confusing or less complicated, would probably have finished closer to part one. And what you're describing, I'm not sure how that, part of it would be coming up with a 75 words and describing it. But I think when you compare the two, that the first one was very kind of a straightforward timing question. The other one, while I'm sure that the stakeholders and insiders in the community followed that discussion and that debate, I would expect that a large percentage didn't follow or didn't understand. And so that's what we're kind of up against in trying to describe it to that, large majority. So
I could
it's really up to all of you if you do more.
Make a suggestion and an introductory to that would be while removing the mayor's ability to break a tie, involving a city council person to fill a vacancy and maintaining the current seniority rotation, but memorializing it in the charter, something like that. I think that's pretty simple.
So if I could just comment.
City manager.
Go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, I have a feeling that part two is also getting the responses you get because number one, voters aren't necessarily aware how it is this process has gone down in the past, informally. And when you ask about the selection of the mayor, a couple things can pop up. Number one, they're saying, well, I know that in some cities the voters select the mayor, so I prefer that option. That isn't an option as part of part two. And so that may lead some people to think, I'm not voting for part two because of that, right? I'd rather, have control of that as the voters ourselves. Others might look at it as, it says once a member serves as a mayor, they're moved back to sequence. What happens if we have a great mayor, right? And we want to keep the mayor. Well, we can't do that here either, right? So that can be a little troublesome, and just basing it on seniority, there's lots of reasons why someone could look at part two and go, that's not what I want, right? I have a better idea out there. And so I don't personally know that adding the mayor tiebreaker is going to get us around some of those issues.
So I suggest you go back and review the December 2022 meetings and see how many people turned out for this and how hot it was.
All right.
So thank you very much.
Noted. Thank you.
Yep. Anything you wanted to add, City Manager?
No, I was just going to say that at this point, we don't have plans to survey any further. We've
Right.
completed our surveys.
We
At
have a
this
set
point in time.
information set. Yep.
That's
Okay. Councilmember Lorraine.
Thank you, through the mayor. If we were to defer the charter amendment measures to another election date, could we conduct a deeper survey between now and then that goes into the same or similar kind of detail with regard to answers before and after information is given, arguments and how they did, language considerations, et cetera, that we see with the land use measure today?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Newsom.
I was curious, did True North provide us with survey statistics for the pass-fail likelihood from Measure R's and Y?
I believe so, Tim.
Which ones are those? Sorry.
That's the 2020 election.
So we have worked with the city on past measures that have been successful. So when we've done the polling and said, you can move forward, and the polling said that you've gone forward and been successful.
Okay.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I don't think Measure R was placed on the ballot by the city. It was a competing measure, so I don't think we would have polled on that. So I think we did poll on Y, and Measure R was put on there later, which may have influenced the outcome of how that turned out.
Yeah, I've heard, but I can't find in writing that Measure Y was predicted to have failed by upwards of 20%. Not sure if that's accurate.
I came in at sort of while that was happening, so sort of late in the game, but the city didn't put Measure Y on, or Measure R on the ballot, as far as I know.
Do we have any demographic survey results? Sorry, do we have any demographics on the surveyed 600 people? I.e., do we know what percentage of them are, age demographics or homeowner versus renter? And if they
We
vote
have all
previously?
that. We just have to go through the crosstabs
Okay.
for that information.
And then is there legal challenges to operating outside of the charter currently by, for example, not having districts or, in the charter and operating with them?
Well, right now, we operate under district elections because we're complying with state law. So while at the same time, we do need to change the charter to simply reflect our the current state of our election system.
So another option could potentially be that we go and make a charter motion or charter amendments on the things that we have to do to be within compliance. And then we circle back, for example, to a primary election for the other things that we want to change.
I mean, I think there's different options for you, but that's the question before the council now is how to time the charter amendments.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions. If I read it correctly, the research needs more information was the number 3 reason why the initial ballot survey, why people said, I disagree. That was the number 3 reason,
Or
Dr. McClarty?
Disagree or unsure. So
Unsure.
if they were disagree or unsure and you ask them why, a
Mhm.
certain percentage would say, I just need more information on this.
Okay, great. So there is clearly an opportunity, or I would interpret that. Am I correct in interpreting that opens the door to a community education campaign? Yep.
Correct. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, and then number 2, there were 2 questions. Q7F2, which is what came in number 1, most positive, i.e. people are being pushed out of San Mateo, so we have to create more affordable housing. And Q7F1, which was we don't have enough affordable housing so that people who want to come to San Mateo can come to San Mateo. And I read those as sort of 2 sides of the same issue. There's a lack of affordable housing, and people reacted more positively to this first question. We're pushing out our elders and our young people. And the question further down it's expensive and we can't get new families, essential workers. That was important, but it wasn't as critical. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the thing that really stands out from the positive arguments is that, when you talk about this measure as providing opportunities for existing residents to stay in the community, that's the most compelling positive, right? It's less compelling when you're talking about others coming to the community who don't already live here, right?
Mhm.
But in allowing people to stay in the community that they've grown up in, right, or lived in a long time, was the most compelling piece of that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Lots of other questions, but to move on in the interest of time, moving on to the charter amendments, I guess we sort of did those charter amendment questions. We did one question. It was sort of at the end of the land use research. So in terms of the depth of information we got into, it was much deeper on the land use versus the charter amendments, yes?
Correct.
Yes.
Right, so there was sort of one question. So I'm hearing amongst a lot of council members, a lot of continuing questions about the charter amendments, as well as what Councilmember Hedges said. There was a whole nother section to the discussion that isn't answered, as well as Deputy Mayor Newsom, all the cleanup. So that's sort of leaving a whole section where we have to assume something or say we need more information. Yeah, so that, okay. Okay, well then I will leave my questions there, and why don't we come back to comments and direction by the council?
If
Yeah. Did
If
you want to
I
say
may just
something?
add one thing, there was the question earlier about the polling that we did for measures that have gone to ballot in the city of San Mateo. I didn't know what the measured letters were. We did polling for the TOT measure as well as the real property transfer tax measures. Both of those indicated those measures would be successful. Both of them ultimately were. We did not do polling related to Measure Y or that election cycle.
Okay, thank you. And City Manager, just want to throw it over to you. Is there anything you would like to share in terms of the public comment we received or anything else before we move on?
Just look for feedback on the 4 questions that are before you this evening to provide staff the direction. The other piece is, should the council wish to move forward on doing education and information, we have lined up about 56 different stakeholder groups that we'd have to get in front of over the next, between now and July 14th. And that would include hopefully some support from the council members to help with education and information, as well as 5 staff members.
Okay, thank you. Then let me bring it back to council for comment and specific response to the 4 questions. Councilmember Lee, would you like to start?
For number 1, should the city proceed with education and outreach on land use measure and return to council for a decision? Yes. Should the city council proceed with education and outreach on the charter amendments measure and return to council for a decision whether to place them on the ballot measure? Yes. I do believe that there is an opportunity for further information. It would be very helpful for us to have a review of previous charter amendment ballot measures. Were they presented to the electorate as comprehensive updates? There seems to be an opportunity here to combine into one ballot measure, which would, I think, take, and to some extent, reduce the clutter on the ballot, which I think should be strongly considered. And I think in the absence of having visual historic information, understanding what the appetite from the community has been to support charter amendments, I think that I would like to believe that there's still opportunity to entertain and learn about this, how the council can effectively position ourselves to do the work that we've promised to do for this community. Number 3, does the city council have feedback on staff's proposed education, information, and outreach plan? I am in favor and support the multilingual approach. I agree with the partnership and collaboration with stakeholder groups. I think that having the FAQ and and proactively managing the misinformation campaign that we know will be coming is going to be very important to this effort. And number 4, should the land use ballot language be revised to insert the phrase without raising taxes? I absolutely agree that that should be considered. I also would like to hear from the experts where or if they would consider better highlighting that concern around reducing traffic impacts, perhaps bringing that closer to the top of the sentence I think would be beneficial. And I want to just say, having lived through the experience of, as our whole community did, being deprived of mayoral and deputy mayoral representation, there was an unprecedented breach of protocol and tradition when 2 council members on their first day in office betrayed our governing document, the city charter. Our procedures were not followed. Our community was deprived of leadership, and it was a grave stain on this city. And we have an opportunity, and I think an obligation, to rectify this. There were over 1,350 community members who came out in support, outraged, completely aghast that our community was deprived of representation. That should never happen. It should never have happened, and it should never happen again. We had faith leaders. We had elected leaders. We had organizational leaders. The Democratic Party, the California Young Democrats, the Carpenters, IBEW, Jewish Democratic Club of Silicon Valley, the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, the National Women's Political Caucus of Silicon Valley, Peninsula for Everyone, Peninsula Young Democrats, Reach Coalition, the San Mateo County API Caucus, the San Mateo County Democratic Party Executive Board, the San Mateo County Latinx Democratic Executive Board, the San Mateo County Stonewall Democrats Executive Board, the Sanitary Truck Drivers and Helpers Local number 350, the Sierra Club Loma Prieta chapter. The list goes on. We made national news in all the wrong ways. We do not want this to ever happen again in our city, and we have an opportunity to close this loophole to ensure that the community will always have representation as we deserve. So I feel very strongly that this council has a moral obligation to act. I don't think that it is wise to sit on it. I don't see a justification for delaying this because we know that in all likelihood, future years will also have future initiatives that deserve our attention and that will be crowding the ballot. We know that there's always going to be competing needs. What we also know is that we have a chance to rectify the wrongs and ensure every single community member goes with the representation that we are entitled to.
Thank you very much. Who would like to speak next? Councilmember Lorraine, thank you.
Thank you, through the mayor. Number 1, yes. Number 2, I would say yes, in that I would agree with yes, insofar as I believe with the resources we have and understanding the timeline we're under, I do think if there were an opportunity to dig a little more into understanding as best we can with what we've already surveyed, the potential impact of, the quantified impact potentially. What impact can we get out of, putting perhaps an aggregated charter amendment on the ballot? I would say that it would have been ideal to have dived into the charter amendments in a similar fashion as we did with the land use so that we could have had more information and made a more robust decision at this time. Perhaps that wasn't, I understand we are not there at this time, but I think given that the land use measure seems to have, what has been presented as, an uncommon stability, a relatively lower volatility, and a gap between a simple majority and the current results. I would like to understand a little more of maybe how much of an impact these charter amendments might have if they were put on the ballot. So I'll mention that, but I will also say that I think that it would be okay to, if this were taken up at a future election as well. And I appreciate staff looking into opportunities beyond the November elections, given what Councilmember Lee had brought up last time, which I thought was a good point, as she had mentioned tonight as well. There will always be competing priorities. However, I think, it's possible that, though, I think it would be good for us to kick the tires a little bit more on what we have. We may come to the conclusion that it might be best to defer the charter amendments to another election, and if so, I would want to keep open the prospect of going to the primary. I even if it is more expensive, it would seem to me that would help us avoid, if after our due diligence, we come to the conclusion that we just don't think it's worth risking something as important as the land use measure, then given what was discussed about the future elections in November, we may find ourselves in the same position again in 2026. And I think, facing a decision deferred then would be a problem. This is a council priority. And I think it's important that we do our best to find the best earliest opportunity to pass those charter amendments. For number 3, I think I don't have too much additional feedback to add from what was already been given. And for number 4, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Hedges.
So these questions are stated very well. So number 1, yes. Number 2, I have mixed opinions on this. Question for Mr. McClarney, or anybody else that wants to jump in. How dangerous do you think it is to have both of these on the ballot together? I don't want to see either one of them go down, but definitely not the land use issue.
So we didn't test it, in a format where they were necessarily together. So I don't have data on this. I'm just telling you what I've seen over time in other elections. And the idea is, we have a land use measure that is going to be somewhat controversial in its own right. We know this in the community. It's kind of an issue that's divided the community in the past. And so, anytime you have that, you tend not to want to park right next to it another measure that has, for different reasons, the potential to be further, divide people further, right? And obviously part one of that charter amendment wasn't that, but part two was. I mean, you pretty much divided the community into thirds between those who supported it, those who oppose it, and those who didn't know enough about it or didn't understand it enough to have an opinion. So it's hard to say, right, exactly how controversial that is. It depends on how things play out in the election cycle and whether or not you start to get some drama around the charter amendments that then captures people's attention, and maybe sets the mood for the other measures that are on the ballot. So I don't have any hard date on it. I just would say that if you have the flexibility to separate these onto two different elections, that's the safer route to go.
Yeah, and looking at this, and I assumed I've run many elections for my union, and you verify the yes and no votes and go after the undecideds to try to give them education enough to make a reasonable decision. I assume that's what we would be doing with community education. I've really got mixed opinions on this. I want to see it passed as soon as possible because, first of all, there are things that we're doing now that aren't in the charter, and secondly, this is something that can really heal what happened in November. And I think from what Councilmember Lee said, I think you're beginning to get the idea of how controversial that was and how there may be still some lap over on it. And going 2 years more, the institutional memory seems to fade on things like that. It might be a better shot from that point of view. So I'm going to come back to that because I'm really not decided. So number 3, of course, yes. And I guess July 14th is as far as we can go?
July.
Okay. And of course, without raising taxes, and probably an introductory clause to the issue. So I'm going to go back to 2. I think that phrase I used, the institutional memory, I think I'm going to go with 26.
Thank you. Yes, Councilmember Lorraine.
Thank you, Mayor. I apologize, but I think I've been, while Councilmember Hedges was speaking, I feel that I may have confused myself a little bit with regard to what we were really talking about when we were talking about number 2. And I think when we're talking about, if we're talking about should the city proceed with education and outreach on the charter amendment measures, I am concerned that that might be confusing, because if we do that without a deep understanding, I guess I am a little concerned that if we were to proceed with education and outreach on the land use measure and these charter amendment measures, and I don't even think we've really discussed like whether we're like which of them and how many and so on, that would be a lot. And if I believe that I'll say that I wish we had done a little more work on how much impact something like this really can make by putting it together on the ballot with the land use measure. I'm not sure that proceeding with education and outreach will give us what we need. I'm torn.
So I can help the council. I'm hearing a few of you being torn. What we could do, it just costs money, run a survey. I think we have enough time, and just put the two, we do an aggregate one. I would think we'd do one charter amendment, not rather than 2, one charter amendment, and then a land use measure, and see how it surveys. Have Tim's company go ahead and do that. It just would cost
Can
more
I
money.
say, though, that there are several elements to the charter amendments and that we didn't talk about 2 of them. So would you be proposing to put all 4 aspects of it in? Because I think all 4 are important.
So what we would have to do then, we'd have to have a separate item. I'd have to come back at another meeting and just talk about what exactly you would want in that. But I still think there's enough time. I would say, Tim, would there be enough time to run?
Yeah, you know, if you were to do that and we move quickly, I would want to sort of do data collection sort of mid to later part of June. But it's doable.
About all four.
So we could look at that. I know that we have a special meeting on the 30th. If we wanted, if people had more time, we could tack on and have a conversation for another hour about what this means potentially.
Deputy Mayor Newsom, do you have some comments?
Well, I was going to say yes for one. Two, I am in the same boat as I think all of us. I would say leaning towards yes to, but with the idea that we may not put it on the ballot for this time and move it to the next primary election. I know in the big picture, I don't want to do that, but if that's what's going to take to pass the land measure, that's where I am. Three, to what Alex is saying, I would love to see, you know, if we had charter cleanup items versus the mayoral rotation, if there's a difference pulling out.
So speaking with the attorney right now, wouldn't want to have the charter cleanup items or district elections along with the mayoral decisions. So if you're going with one, not putting one, so you have to decide which one you'd want to go with.
I mean,
So
legally.
they are going to be two amendments either way.
So-
It's not going to be.
So this is what I've said during multiple study sessions and both public hearings is I've recommended all along that you have two different charter amendments because one is more of a cleanup measure and the other is more attention getting and dealing with how you pick the mayor, how vacancies are filled and other matters. Because you want to make sure that the cleanup measure, especially since it would reflect or change the district elections, you want to ensure that that measure passes. You want to give it the best chances for success. And if you combine it into one measure, you risk that measure failing. So it's not illegal to combine it in one measure. I just don't recommend it.
And just,
On four, I just will say yes. And then
Okay.
we
Through the
can.
mayor.
yes.
I just want to make it very abundantly clear. You're presenting a campaign strategy. You're not presenting a legal analysis. Legally, it is completely within our right to decide how we want to time and couple or decouple any one ballot measure. That is within the powers of the city council. It is an analysis, right, that you're providing a strategic analysis, not a legal requirement. I think
I think I was pretty explicit when I said it's not illegal to combine it in one measure. I just think it's not a good idea because it increases the likelihood of it failing.
However, I mean, I think it's important to note, as we have in the past, that we've already converted to district, right? We are already operating, we're operating under state law, right? We are in compliance with state law. So there is very little legal downside to coupling the two measures. If it fails, we can run it again separately, right? The risk, the liability risk is very low if it does fail. And furthermore, I just want to if we're asking, I strongly agree that there is an opportunity and a need to assuage some of the confusion and sort of the discomfort that we're all feeling, not knowing exactly how to measure the potential impact of a charter amendment alongside the land use ballot measure. Right. And so, I wonder from, Dr. McClerney's perspective, how much precision, how much actual, data are we able to glean in another process? Like, will we be able to say in a definitive way that there is a measurable impact? Or are we going to be back here, in a couple months with sort of a gut feeling based on, what we've seen, maybe in the past? So, I think that's an important.
We can ask Tim right now.
Right. That's an important question to Tim.
Tim?
I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind, no matter when we do this survey, it is not a crystal ball looking forward and saying what the next 5 months are going to look like to election day, right? It's going to tell us where we're at in a snapshot of time. And I think that the challenge here is it isn't so much the charter, what's in the charter amendment by itself when someone is confronted with the ballot language and how that's going to shape their opinion about the land use measure, as it is the drama that unfolds during the election cycle, right? And it's hard, that's organic, and it's hard to sit here today and understand exactly what that's going to look like, right? That's why I don't think we're gonna. I'm just, I do this for a living, and I'm the one telling you that if we can do a survey on it, we can see that there may be some interaction, but it's going to be very difficult to simulate that blow up moment that may or may not happen during an election cycle over a charter amendment on the mayor, because we don't know how that's going to play out, right? So it's a little bit of a challenge to. You asked about a definitive answer. I don't know that we're going to get a definitive answer. We'll have more information.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you, Dr. McLaren. I would love to say something. I think what we're missing here, this is all important discussion, and the charter amendments are critical, and we need to find the best way to pass them. But the most important thing here right now is the land use amendment. And if we do not find a way to pass that, then we will be back here as a council, and we will have 6 months in order to come up with a whole nother zoning recommendation that will include increasing zoning in single-family neighborhoods and other things. And whether you agree with that or not, I mean, we've heard someone in public comment tonight talk about how they thought we should not make this ballot initiative, that we should keep Measure Y. We heard someone else talk about how maybe we should blow it all up. So there is clearly a lot of emotion on this topic. And I think I look at it from a research perspective, having had a career that worked with research, and we need to really focus on this land use measure. I think the opportunity to do the charter amendments in June of 2026 would give us opportunity to research about all the other areas. And I really agree with Councilmember Hedges that there's a lot more to the charter amendments and the discussions and disagreements that we had a couple of years ago that need to be discussed. So I think just trying to wrap it all up in one ball we're not going to be able to judge what's going to happen there. So my strong recommendation would be that we proceed in November, to July, whatever. And number one, on the land use measure, that we do not proceed with education and outreach on the charter amendments until we have more time to do research into what that is being said, looking at June of 2026. Number three, that certainly we need to go into more feedback on proposed, and I would raise my hand to do as much outreach as someone wants me to, and that we should add without raising taxes to the land use ballot language. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Through the mayor, at this point, I'm concerned that, the majority of council is undecided. And so I think, what I would ask is if there's an opportunity for staff to go back and look at what are the viable options in speaking with our professionals, what more could be gleaned, and then come back with, a presentation of some options at a later date.
I think our professionals have really told us right now of what the information that can provide. I'm happy to continue this discussion with the council. The main question outstanding is whether or not we want to move forward with a charter amendment, education and outreach at this time.
My understanding was that just 5 minutes ago, there was discussion about going back and doing potentially another survey that would look at a combined charter amendment, which is within, council's discretion to do so, and that there would be time allowing for that, and potentially we could better analyze the interplay and impact of running both of those ballot measures simultaneously.
I guess where I was coming from with the information at hand is what I heard from our survey consultant, Tim McLarney, to respond to the question that happened about whether or not we survey and what we'll get. I did not get a definitive that is going to help us out. Tim, I don't know if you have any thoughts further about that.
No, like I said, I think we can certainly test that. What it's not going to be able to capture is what ultimately happens during the election cycle. If suddenly these charter amendments become a hotter issue in the community and further divide the community, it's hard to capture that in the space of the survey, right? And if people start campaigning hard on those charter amendments, it's hard to see how that's helpful to your land use measure. I don't see a path where that's helpful to have them on the same ballot. I do see the potential for them being, creating more of a challenge for your land use measure.
So I'm hearing, so I hear from our survey consultant. I think I just want to go down the list. Do we want to move forward or not? I kind of keep hearing kind of mixed feelings. Okay, I have 2026 for one.
Yes, I'm sorry to say I will change my answer to no on number 2.
I also will change to 2026.
And I will remain at 2026. So no.
Councilmember Lee.
I'm steadfast that we move forward with 24. We just heard from our professionals that there's high confidence in stability of our land use issue, which would be, from my perspective, a reason to move forward with the charter amendments. It seems that there's a gap in the polling. We did not seem to poll a comprehensive survey. We did not poll the surveys, the survey impact in coupling it or decoupling it. So there's a lot of information that I don't feel like we have right now to make a fully informed decision. It's unfortunate because this was clearly articulated as a council priority. And we clearly were moving forward with the intent of putting this on the ballot this year. And so, it's unfortunate that there were gaps in our own analysis that I think lead us to have deep questions about the timing and viability. And now it sounds like we're not even willing to contemplate revisiting a deeper analysis.
So I just asked the council, just respectfully, I asked the council and they gave me direction to go with 2026. And so I think that's the direction. I have all the information that I need to keep moving forward as I need to implement the will of the majority of the council at this time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And we will take a 10-minute break. Thank you very much, everyone. And I appreciate everyone who's out in the audience who came for the regular session and is still waiting. We appreciate your patience.